Once we have the word to be guessed, we need a method that converts the word into a string that is a combination between guessed characters and underscores. To do this, let's go to the region called GameEngine and create a new method. Let's indicate that the method is private, that it is void, that it is called, for example, calculateWord. Let's create a couple of parameters as part of the method signature. The first parameter will correspond to the string to be guessed, and the second parameter will correspond to a list of characters, which will be the letters that have been pressed throughout the game, whether or not a guess has been made. As part of the method, we're going to define a variable called temp, and we will assign answer to it. We will invoke the select method, which receives a lambda expression. That may seem a little complicated, but it is not so complicated. In the lambda expression, we're going to indicate guessed.indexOf. As parameter, we pass x, and after the closing parentheses, we write greater or equal to 0. In case this is true, we return the value of x. In the case that the condition is not met, we will return an underscore and close the parentheses. From this projection, let's do a conversion to an array. What does this code we have written mean? Well, first of all, let's use the word we are trying to guess. Subsequently, through the select method, whose definition tells us that the projection of each element of the sequence is carried out in a new form, we will process each of the characters of the string through the lambda expression. The x represents each of the letters, and if this letter is in the list of letters that have been selected by the player, the letter will be returned. Otherwise, that is, if the letter of the word to guess has not been selected by the player, an underscore will be returned to indicate that the player has not yet guessed a letter. Next, we need to bind a property to the entry control that displays this string we have formed. To do this, let's go to the top of the code and proceed to create a new region called, for example, UI properties. Inside this region, we will create a new property of type string that is called, for example, spotlight. Let's define a get and a set to later convert the property into a full property. Let's create a block body for the set, and inside, after the assignment to the spotlight field, let's invoke onPropertyChanged to notify the graphical interface that there was a change. Once we have created this property, let's assign a value to it. After the result of the execution of the calculateWord method is obtained, let's assign the spotlight property the value of string.join, since we want to join each of the characters in the array into a single string. As a parameter, let's pass an empty space between each of the characters of the array, and subsequently, we must pass the array of characters that will be joined in the string. Once the method is defined, we proceed to invoke it after invoking the pickWord method in the constructor. We must pass two parameters. First, what is going to be the word to guess, and then we are asked for a list of characters. We do not have this list yet, therefore we're going to go to the section of the fields and create a list of characters that are going to be the set of letters that have been pressed by the user. We're going to call the list guessed, which will be equal to a new list of characters. Once we have the list, we're going to pass it as part of the invocation of the calculateWord method. With this, when we execute the calculateWord method, we will already have in the spotlight property the final string. Let's copy the name of the property and we're going to bind it to the graphical interface. Let's look for which is the label control that contains this representation, and let's indicate that instead of this static string, we want to use a binding to the spotlight property. I'm going to go back to the Android emulator. I'm going to start running the application to see how it behaves. And we can now see the application. However, notice that the text we generated is not showing up. Can you guess why it is not working correctly? Well, if we recall the previous lessons in the data binding section, you may remember that we need to set the binding context from which we're going to take the information to fill the graphical interface. In our example, we're going to go to the constructor and we're going to indicate that after the initialize component method, you want to set the binding context, which will be equal to, and what do you think should be the object from which we are going to take the information? Well, reviewing the code where the graphical user interface properties are found, as for example, the spotlight property is in the main page class. Therefore, we can indicate that the data context is going to be the reference of the main page instance. We can establish this through the assignment to this. In this way, we are indicating that the data context is going to be this same page, and therefore we are going to have access to the spotlight property. Let's start the execution of the application. And now we can see the label control, which is showing us what is going to be the word to guess. Let's test the application one more time so that you can see that a different string is generated. And indeed, this time the number of letters to be guessed is longer. With this, we have already established the data binding for this label control.